Web hosting providers offer a way for you to rent space on a server on the World Wide Web. You let them take care of all the hosting issues, like security, performance, and ensuring the website is accessible 24/7 on the web. Then you can focus on the design and development of your website. At a basic level, the website hosting provider gives you some space and processing on a server. You can upload your website files and they'll be available on the web. Some providers also allow you to purchase the domain name that your site uses right from them, but this isn't a service that necessarily has to come from the hosting provider. Domain names are managed and sold by domain name registrars, and not all hosting providers can provide that service. But the web hosting provider will let you point your domain name to the site that's being hosted by configuring DNS, and some web hosting providers will also provide their own DNS server, so you can manage all of this from the web hosting provider's interface. Later in the course, I'll be showing you how to purchase a domain name from a third-party domain name registrar and configure a DNS server on the internet to associate the domain name with the IP address of your website. Another thing you may want for your site is an SSL certificate in case you want traffic to be encrypted to and from the site. This is also something you purchase through a domain registrar, but again, it's a service that the web hosting provider might also offer. Either way, you can upload the certificate to the web server so it can be used with your domain name. If you type website hosting into your favorite search engine, you'll find about 500,000 results. There are many web hosting providers on the internet. Besides the criteria I just mentioned, how do you decide which one to go with? Well, your first thought might be price, but let's consider some other things that might actually be more important to you. In fact, I've assembled 10 things that you should look at when evaluating a web hosting provider and the plans they offer. And these are before you even consider the price. These criteria aren't necessarily in order of importance, because you may have different priorities based on past experiences, and not all of these may be important considerations for you, depending on your needs. They're just things that I offer for consideration. The first major criteria for choosing a web hosting provider has to do with what you're hosting. In this course, we're hosting an HTML website, so that's already decided for us. But if you were starting from scratch and didn't have the skills to create an entire website yourself, you might go with a content management system like WordPress, Drupal, or Joomla. These are basically pre-existing websites that let you configure pages and focus more on content than on development, although they sometimes have the ability to modify some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript directly. You'll see many web hosting providers that offer managed versions of these content management systems, which means you don't have to install and maintain the product yourself. Some web hosting providers have hosting plans specifically for these products, as well as more general hosting plans for traditional web development, like the kind that you've been learning in this path. Some hosting providers offer a website builder tool also, which lets you follow a wizard to have a site write the HTML for you. And you can even get more advanced features like shopping cart functionality built in. For hosting our HTML site, though, we don't need any of those features. Just be aware of these offerings so you don't choose one of the plans when it's not actually what you need. The next question is, what sort of frameworks do we need to run on the server? This goes back to the clip on understanding web servers, where we talked about static versus dynamic hosting. Your website might have been developed using a certain framework, like ASP.NET, or PHP, Java, or Ruby, or others. This isn't a concern if you're hosting static files, like our HTML site, because the web server doesn't need to run any code on the server side. Most frameworks nowadays can run on both Linux and Windows servers, but that doesn't mean that they're available with your plan, because they actually need to be installed on the server. So the choice of operating system is another criteria. In the past, hosting on Linux servers was typically much cheaper because many Linux distributions are open source, so it didn't cost the hosting provider as much to run Linux servers as it would to purchase a license for Windows servers. But this doesn't seem to be as much of an issue nowadays, as prices are pretty close for hosting on Linux or Windows, if not the same. The operating system can influence the features and frameworks that are supported also, but this won't be much of a consideration for our purposes, because a website that only uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can be hosted on either platform. The next consideration is capacity, meaning the amount of storage you need and the amount of memory and processing power. Storage is obvious. You need enough storage to accommodate the files that you plan to host. If your site has a lot of audio or video files, that can add up. But processing and memory have more to do with the amount of traffic you anticipate. Some providers will allow you to start small and scale up if your site becomes popular and has more visitors. With some providers, like Microsoft Azure, you can actually configure your site to scale out automatically by adding additional web servers. and that can be triggered by the amount of load that the site is under from your visitors. Other providers allow you to manually increase your capacity by moving to another plan. Many web hosting providers host your site on a shared server, meaning that your site shares the resources of the server with other websites from other customers of the hosting provider. That might be fine, but for a business site that has expectations for performance, you might not want that, because a poorly coded website from another customer could impact the performance of your site. In that case, you could move to a virtual private model, where your site has a specified amount of memory and processing power allotted to it that isn't influenced by other sites on the server. Or you could choose to host your site on a dedicated server, or even a pool of servers, for best performance. Again, starting out, you probably don't need that. Some website hosting plans charge you based on the amount of disk space and bandwidth that you consume. And by bandwidth, I mean the amount of traffic that your website sees from visitors on the web. Some web hosting providers advertise unlimited storage and bandwidth, but of course, there are always limits. A more accurate description would be unmetered rather than unlimited. In other words, they don't charge you extra under normal usage. Read the fine print of your hosting agreement to find out the real limits. When you hit a certain limit, for example, when your site has a spike in traffic because you wrote the greatest blog post on the internet, your provider might charge you more for going over the bandwidth limits, or you might even need to move to a different plan with dedicated servers to handle the load. Some hosting providers will provide additional services, like email, and that will be included with your plan. Remember in the clip on web servers, I said that there are other services that can run on ports on a server, like SMTP for mail. FTP, or File Transfer Protocol, is another service that's typically offered by a web hosting provider, and that's how we'll be deploying our site later in this module. Hosting providers allow you to manage your site configuration using a web-based control panel. The capabilities of such a panel can vary from provider to provider, but some allow you to see the panel they use before you buy. There are some standard administration panels used by many providers, so capabilities are often similar between web hosting providers. Another consideration is support. What kind of support is included in your hosting plan, and is it available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? If your site goes down in the middle of the night or on a weekend, you want someone to be able to respond. This is pretty standard with web hosting providers, but it's worth it to read through the features for your particular plan. When you choose a hosting plan, you may only be looking to host a single website, but if you plan on hosting sites for multiple projects or multiple clients, you may want to choose a plan that allows you to host several sites. This is often more economical and gives you a single control panel to manage all of your websites. And finally, we get to price. Prices can vary a bit between providers, and the price you see advertised is often an introductory price for the first term of your plan, and it will increase when the plan renews. Or perhaps the price is only valid for a certain number of months. So make sure you read all the information to know what the price will become once the offer period completes. Know what's included in the plan too, because some advertised features may require extra fees. There will often be a chart comparing the different plans that a website hosting provider offers, and that will make it clear which features are included in each plan and which features may be add-ons. So we've gone over what to look for in a web hosting provider. In the remainder of this module, we'll be setting up an account with a web hosting provider, and we'll be using GoDaddy, which is one of the most popular hosting providers on the web. Then you'll see how to upload your website files to that web server using a standard approach by downloading an FTP client tool and connecting to the web server. Then we'll look at another web hosting provider, App Services in Microsoft Azure, and we'll upload our website files there too using the same FTP client tool.